Are you feeling inadequate today? If not, consider the fact that at 22, Alexander the Great had already begun his invasion of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the greatest empire the world had yet seen. By 25, he had effectively taken it over and begun systematically extending its jurisdiction to new lands and peoples, who had for the past 2 centuries resisted Persian rule. In other words, Alexander did in a lifetime what it normally took centuries to accomplish, and in a brief lifetime, one might add, because by 32, Alexander was dead. If, like me, you really are feeling inadequate at this point, then rest assured that we're all in good company. According to the Roman historian and notorious gossip Suetonius, a 30-something-year-old Julius Caesar chanced upon a statue of Alexander the Great during his time in Spain. Upon seeing it, he's supposed to have heaved a sigh, as if frustrated in having as yet done nothing noteworthy at a time of life when Alexander had already brought the world to his feet. According to Plutarch, Caesar is even supposed to have wept. Today, I want to hold back the tears and follow Alexander to the ends of the earth. We'll pick up exactly where we left off in the first act, right at the Hellespont, and follow Alexander into Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Bactria, Sogdiana, and what lay beyond. We're going to proceed from march to march, from battle to battle, from wound to wound, so we can come to some understanding of how Alexander managed to conquer what the Greeks called the Ecumeny, the inhabited world. Alright, let's begin with some context about the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So the founder of this empire was Cyrus the Great, who ruled from 559 to 530 BC, and there is a mythical origin of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, as well as a more prosaic one. According to the mythical origin, the king of the Medes, Astyages, dreamed that his daughter would give birth to the master of Asia, meaning that her son would displace Astyages. And not wanting this to happen, he married her off to some nobody from the south. He then had another dream where vines sprouted from his daughter's womb and engulfed the whole of his empire. And so he told one of his generals, Harpagus, to kill the infant, only for Harpagus to defy the king and hand over the infant to a cowherd. And this infant was, of course, Cyrus. By age 10, his identity was more or less found out when he ordered that one of his playmates be beaten, not something that a boy of his station would usually have the gall to do. And so he was brought before the king, who, fortunately for Cyrus, decided to spare him. Harpagus, the general who had defied his king, was not so lucky, however. Harpagus' son was brought before the king, and as punishment was basically turned into Median shish kebab and then served to an unwitting Harpagus. In other words, Harpagus was forced to eat his own son. Astyages, the king of the Medes, got his comeuppance, though. Eventually, Cyrus overthrew his grandfather and founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire. According to the more prosaic version of events, though, Cyrus became king of Media by 549, king of Lydia by 547, and king of Babylon by 539. He lived to the ripe old age of 70 and founded an empire that lasted 200 years. His successor, Cambyses II, who ruled from 530 to 522, expanded the empire into Egypt, and Cambyses was followed by the Trajan of the Achaemenids, Darius the Great, who ruled from 522 to 486. And under Darius, the Persians expanded into the Indus Valley, Thrace, the Cyclades, Naxos, and Macedonia, the on-again, off-again, semi-autonomous vassal of the Achaemenids. Darius was stopped at Marathon during the first Persian invasion of Greece, which he launched, and the second invasion was launched by his successor, Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465. His invasion was stopped at Salamis. And the Battle of Salamis was honestly a much bigger deal to the Greeks than it was to the Persians, but the noteworthy thing about Xerxes' reign was that it ended the period of Persian expansion. There would be no major territorial changes to the Achaemenid Empire for the next century that it lasted. Therefore, we can fast forward to Darius III, who became the king of kings, the king of the Achaemenid Empire in 336, the same year that Alexander became the king of Macedon. Okay, back to Alexander now. What exactly was his situation on the eve of the invasion? Well, for starters, he was cash-strapped. He didn't have a lot of money, and I guess the money from the sack of Thebes had all been spent or was just not sufficient for the cost of army maintenance. The League of Corinth, the collection of Greek city-states that were paying tribute to Macedon, also were not coughing up that much in terms of men and material. In fact, there would be more Greeks fighting as mercenaries for the great king of Persia than there would be fighting for Alexander the Great. And I know that's going to get some people riled up in the comments, judging from the comment section of the last video, but them's the facts. As for the size and composition of Alexander's army, it was about 50,000 men, including the advanced guard sent across the Hellespont early under Parmenion. There was a Macedonian corps. There were some Greek mercenaries. There were Balkan auxiliaries, the Thracians and Triballi. There was the much vaunted Thessalian cavalry, and there were the non-combatants, the engineers, doctors, cartographers, secretaries, and scholars, most notably Callisthenes, who was the campaign historian and apologist, essentially. And it's been observed that Napoleon was directly inspired by Alexander in taking a bunch of Legion of Honor scholars with him on his invasion of Egypt in the close of the 18th century. The last thing that Alexander did in Europe was to sacrifice to a guy called Protolaus. This was one of the many suitors of Helen during the Trojan War, and he is supposed to have been the first one to jump ashore after the Greeks made landfall in Asia Minor, and he is also supposed to have been the first to die. Now, interestingly, the Persian fleet were going to let Alexander cross the Hellespont. So, because I brought up the Egyptian campaign, this is kind of the opposite of that, where Napoleon slipped past the British fleet at a time when the Mediterranean was a British lake. But here, even though the Persians similarly have naval superiority, they let Alexander cross because they had already fended off the advanced guard under Parmenion, and they wanted to trap Alexander, trap this boy king in their mind in order to quickly defeat him. And just like a boy king might, Alexander puts Parmenion in charge of the main force and then heads out with a detachment of his boys, essentially, and commandeers a vessel personally, goes straight to the middle of the Hellespont, kills and sacrifices a bull to Poseidon, drops it in the ocean, and then proceeds to Troy, which already by then was thousands of years old, a Bronze Age tourist destination because of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander, of course, was a huge fan of, believing himself a descendant of Achilles. And so while there, Alexander sacrifices to Zeus, to Athena, to his other ancestor, Hercules, and then for Achilles, he does something special. He and his buddies strip off their clothes, oil themselves up, and then have a foot race around Achilles' tomb, and then put flowers on it. So your typical Greek activities, I guess. And then notably, Alexander's last sacrifice was to the king of Troy, Priam. And as you might recall from the Iliad, if you've read it, Achilles shows mercy to Priam. He lets him bury his son Hector after giving him a gruesome death. But nonetheless, he shows Priam this one act of mercy after Priam comes and begs for the body of his son. But what you might not know, or what's less talked about, is that Achilles' son shows considerably less mercy to Priam, going on to kill him while Priam is praying. And so in Alexander's mind, being descended from Achilles and Achilles' son, he might be asking for forgiveness here. Now, one tourist trap that Alexander did not want to go see was the Lyre of Paris, the guy who sparked the Trojan War by making off with Helen. And this is because, quoting from Philip Freeman here, he thought Paris a coward drawn more to beautiful women than fame in battle, saying, "I care little for that harp, but would gladly see the lyre of Achilles, on which he sang the glorious deeds of famous men." In this same vein, Alexander says that his one regret for the upcoming invasion is that he didn't have a Homer to accompany him to record all his epic deeds, which strikes me as exactly the type of thing that Kanye West might say.
My greatest pain in life is I will never be able to see me perform.
Now, something about Asia Minor, the Persians actually treated it quite well, unlike other satrapies. And so the settlements in Asia Minor were not in a rush to surrender to Alexander. And so he had to take many of these settlements by force, one of the first of which was Lampascus. But even though Alexander was increasingly in dire financial straits, he forbade his soldiers from looting. And he said that because this was soon going to be Macedonian property, why would they loot their own property? He also cleverly sowed distrust between the great king and arguably his finest general, Memnon of Rhodes. Now, Memnon was Greek-born, which didn't help his case with the Persian nobles, and then Alexander was sowing distrust by saying that his soldiers should specifically avoid looting Memnon of Rhodes' properties. As a side note, the first Greek settlement that Alexander liberated was Priapus, which is also the name of the eternally bricked up son of Dionysus, who also gave his name to a medical condition that just sounds awful. Anyway, so because he forbade his soldiers from looting all these settlements, what Alexander needed was a pitched battle. That way he could get treasure and slaves the right way. But Memnon, this Greek-born general, he prudently suggested not giving Alexander what he wanted, not giving him a pitched battle. He knew all about the potential of the Macedonian Sarissa, and what he advised was just going scorched earth mode in Asia Minor and luring Alexander deeper into Persian territory, and being fully aware of Alexander's money troubles. He knew that this was the winning strategy. But the Persian nobles, as well as the great king himself, were too proud to listen to his advice, and it probably didn't help his case that he was Greek-born, as I have said, and Alexander's little scheme might have also damaged his prospects further. If he was a native-born general, if he was somebody like Fabius, a Roman advising fellow Romans, or Kutuzov, a Russian advising fellow Russians, maybe history would have unfolded differently. Maybe the Persians would have ended up smothering Alexander's expedition in the cradle. All this brings us to the Battle of the Granicus, that is the Granicus River. The Macedonians had about 50,000 men, while the Persians had about 40,000. So for once, the Macedonians would actually outnumber the Persians. Not in terms of cavalry, though. The Macedonians were supposed to have had only about 4,000 cavalry. The Persians 2.5 to 4 times or 5 times as many, 10 to 20,000 cavalry on the Persian side. As the aggressors, the Macedonians were walking up to the Granicus River. The Persians were camped on the other side. And essentially, the Persians had set a trap for Alexander, counting on him being, again, this impetuous boy king, which in some ways he very much was. Crossing the Granicus with its steep and slippery banks would mean the ruin of the Sarissa formation. It would mean that the Persians could rush the Macedonians before they got into their Sarissa formation and posed a major threat to them. In other words, crossing the river would be suicidal. But this is exactly what Alexander wanted to do. Parmenion counseled against it. He advised waiting until the next day, at which time they could cross at dawn before the Persians got into formation, or maybe the Persians would even withdraw by then in order to gather reinforcements, because remember, they were outnumbered. There's one account by Diodorus that has Alexander waiting until dawn the next day, but the traditional account, that of Arrian, who is kind of our guy for Alexander's campaigns, for the real military nitty-gritty, he says that Alexander brushes Parmenion off and says that it would be a shame if a little stream would stop him after crossing the mighty Hellespont. And he also says that he didn't want the Persians to think that he was afraid of them. Now, it has been observed by historians time and time again that Parmenion acts as a kind of literary foil to Alexander, the prudent, older general against the young and bold Alexander. So this conversation might not have taken place, but the end result is the same. Alexander puts his infantry in the center. He puts Parmenion in charge of the left wing. He takes control of the right wing. The wings are cavalry. Alexander is wearing a popular Greek linen cuirass, a linothorax, and this makes him very, very visible, along with his feathered helmet. And so immediately at the start of the battle, the Persians start shifting their cavalry toward Alexander's side so they could just take him out right away. And he gives them exactly what they wanted by charging across the river, but he gives them what they wanted a little bit sooner than they might have been expecting, because the Persian archers aren't able to get as many volleys off as they wanted. And before anybody could realize what was happening, the battle was raging on at the center and devolving into a grueling slugfest with the cavalry on both sides coming to a standstill. And what this actually led to was an opening, breathing room for the Macedonian infantry to cross the river, get into formation, and use their sarissas effectively. And it is while the infantry is advancing that Alexander gets embroiled in an action sequence straight out of a sword and sandal film. He breaks his lance, and so his father's trusty companion, Darius of Corinth, the one who had reconciled Philip and Alexander, the one who also apparently bought Alexander Bucephalus, he hands Alexander a new lance, and then he goes and spears the great king's son-in-law, Mithridates, in the face. And another Persian aristocrat, Roseaces, sees this and rushes to get revenge and slams Alexander in the back of the head, breaks his feathered helmet in two, and leaves him dazed. And somehow Alexander is able to recover his senses and then stab Roseaces. And this is when a third nobleman rushes him from behind. This nobleman is Mithridates, and Alexander is only saved, famously, by another member of the Old Guard, Black Clitus, who chops off Mithridates' arm and saves Alexander's life. So the whole experience probably made Alexander reconsider his stance on the Old Guard, on Philip's men, at least for the time being. So Darius of Corinth, Black Clitus, Parmenion, all of them were indispensable to Alexander for this battle. At that point, the Persians retreat. Only the Greek mercenaries remain. They were expecting to be captured and ransomed, but they would have no such luck. And honestly, the ones who were killed right then and there were probably the lucky ones, because they were at least afforded proper Greek funerary rites and would avoid the suffering of the mines. This was, like Thebes, another example to the Greeks, another warning to them of what would happen if they sided with the Persians over the Macedonians. In the immediate aftermath, Alexander personally tends to the wounded alongside the doctors. Remember, he had some medical knowledge from Aristotle, and he collects all the treasure, apparently including 300 sets of Persian armor, which he has sent to the Acropolis of Athens with the inscription, "Alexander, son of Philip, and all the Greeks, except the Spartans, sent these spoils from the barbarians in Asia." So even in victory, Alexander couldn't resist the chance to be just a little bit petty toward the Spartans, who still were not members of the League of Corinth and weren't worth the trouble for Macedon. From there, Alexander named a new satrap of the Hellespont, and what this meant was that Alexander was going to keep the old Persian administrative structure in place, right down to the tax rates, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, after the Battle of the Granicus, it's not just a straight line to the Battle of Issus, contrary to the traditional narrative. There was a bit of a journey to get there. Stuff did happen between the Granicus and Issus, and some of it is pretty interesting, and it all takes place in Asia Minor. So first off, Alexander has to consolidate his control in Lydia, which speaks a language related to Hittite. This is a land of gold and horses. It was the first place to mint coins in the 7th century BC, and its last king was Croesus, the one who was fooled by the oracle into thinking that he would defeat the Persians only to be defeated himself, and then suffer some unknown fate after he was defeated. The ancient capital of Lydia was Sardis. It was also the capital of the satrapy under the Persian Empire. As such, it was connected to the ancient Elamite capital, which was now the Achaemenid winter capital, Susa. And this was a 1,700-mile stretch of road known as the Royal Road. It allowed the mounted messengers riding across it to travel at a blisteringly fast pace of about 190 miles per day. This was faster than anyone anywhere could go, as Herodotus writes. There's nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. And in a reference to the Royal Road, Alexander asked Menaechmus, his tutor in geometry, whether there was a fast way for him to learn geometry, because he was apparently getting quite impatient. And Menaechmus says, "Sorry, there is no royal road in geometry. There is only one road for us all." But that same story is also told of Ptolemy and Euclid, an even more famous mathematician. Speaking of Sardis, the Persian satrap Mithranes gives it up without a fight. This is a little bit of a mystery, but it allows Alexander to get a much needed injection of Lydian liquidity. and he is able to consolidate his control of Lydia from there. He also takes this opportunity to sideline the Greeks that were part of his army and have them man the garrisons of Lydia, making this more of a Macedonian expedition until the arrival of Greek reinforcements later on. And he also sidelines one of Parmenian's men, Asander. Alexander then proceeds to the Greek-founded city of Ephesus with its Temple of Artemis, the one from Alexander's birth legend, and it's riven between democratic and oligarchic factions. Alexander puts this infighting to rest with bread and circuses, and he even has his portrait made by by one of the city's painters, Apelles, who apparently makes a portrait that Alexander didn't like, but Bucephalus somehow indicated approval of, to which Apelles boldly said that Alexander's horse had better taste than he did. But Alexander decides to give Apelles another chance, and when Apelles makes his second portrait, he depicts Alexander as Zeus, and Alexander likes this version much better. The Macedonians then proceed to Miletus, a sea base, a naval base, which is important for them to take because the Persians have naval superiority. They have 400 vessels. The Macedonians have less than half that. Plus, these are Greek vessels, not Macedonian vessels. And so Alexander doesn't really want to fight the naval war against the Persians. For once, Parmenian is the one encouraging boldness, not Alexander. Parmenian sees an eagle on one of the ship's masts, and he takes this to be a favorable omen, but Alexander points out that the eagle is facing inland, and so that means they gotta keep fighting on land instead of the sea, I guess. This is Alexander probably just rationalizing his strategy, but in any case, after they take Miletus, he is drawn into a rare naval skirmish that he personally takes part in. The Persians attack the inner harbor of Miletus, and he then forces them back. But despite this victory, he immediately after disbands his fleet. So unlike Napoleon, he didn't have to suffer a Trafalgar type of defeat in order to make this decision. He knew that the Persians had way more ships. He didn't trust the Greeks that were manning the ships in the first place. And what he resolved on was a different strategy whereby he was just going to take every port along the Mediterranean and deny the Persians safe harbor anywhere. And he was going to do it that way instead. Alexander then proceeds to Halicarnassus, the birthplace of Herodotus, the father of history. And this was a city founded by the Dorian Greeks, the ones related to the Spartans, now peopled by Ionian Greeks, and ruled by a native Carian line, the name of the region, Caria. And this line was known as the Hecatomnids, who reserved the right to marry their sisters, just like the Achaemenid kings and the Egyptian pharaohs. And Alexander enters Caria fresh on the heels of a dynastic struggle between Pixodorus, the one who had extended the marriage offer to Philip, only for Alexander to swoop in and try to steer the marriage away from his mentally handicapped older brother toward himself, and Pixodorus' sister, Ada. And I guess Alexander had something of a Cleopatra thing going on with her, because he sides with Ada. He had a thing for older ladies, it seems. And he then proceeds to besiege Halicarnassus, and it would be a long and grueling siege, mostly because of Memnon of Rhodes' participation. But the moment that Memnon leaves and scorches earth, leaving a lot of the city destroyed, Alexander is able to take the city and finish the job, destroying it and leaving many of the inhabitants completely exposed to the winter cold. This brings us to the close, the winter of 334 BC. Was winter going to be a respite? If you think so, then clearly you don't know Alexander well enough yet. Alexander did send the majority of his army back home. This was to prevent Macedonian birth rates from plummeting. They would also bring back fresh recruits, but Alexander himself would continue with a skeleton crew to the region of Lycia. The first settlement they take in Lycia is called Telmesis, and this is a legendary story, but apparently Alexander's childhood friend, Nearchus, has an inn in Telmesis, and this inn lets a bunch of dancing girls in. These dancing girls murder the garrison and let Alexander's men in. And this time they were actual girls, unlike that time with the Persian emissaries during the time of Alexander's namesake, Alexander I. And like that story, this is a legendary one, but one way or another, the Macedonians do take the city. Alexander and his men then cross rivers and mountains through a settlement called Phaselis, and he sends some of his Thracians ahead to blaze a trail through Mount Climax. And he and his men ascend this trail and then descend down a seaside path, and the journey is apparently a miserable one. Diodorus says that the men are waist deep in freezing water. Remember, this is winter, and because they are in a single column formation, they are susceptible to ambush, and a people called the Marmares makes use of this, ambushes Alexander's rear guard, and makes off with a bunch of provisions. And we're still getting to know Alexander a little bit as a general, as a guy, and he was not going to turn the other cheek. He immediately set about hunting the Marmares down. They were not expecting this kind of disproportional response, but he goes up looking for them day in, day out through the mountains until he hunts them down. And in a truly desperate measure, the Marmares then decide to kill their women and children to prevent them from becoming Macedonian slaves. And those who didn't have the heart to do the deed themselves end up burning their families inside their homes. And the sole survivors, the men, retreat into the mountains, apparently to continue the struggle, but Alexander just turns his attention elsewhere. He then goes to Pamphylia and Aspendus, which are Greek settlements that surrender without issue. They agree to give the Macedonians tribute, but Aspendus then betrays Alexander, to which he returns, forces them to surrender this time, and doubles tribute payments, raises taxes, and reappropriates some of their land to their neighbors. And this is really Alexander's modus operandi in both the administrative and military sphere. He is going to extend mercy and give settlements and peoples and regions the benefit of the doubt until they betray his trust, at which point he punishes them severely. As winter slowly comes to an end, Alexander plans to rendezvous with Parmenion in Gordium, formerly the capital of Phrygia. He gets lost on the way. He fights a people called the Pisidians. He besieges someplace, breaks off the siege, eventually makes it to Gordium. Parmenion is there with about 3,500 fresh reinforcements, Macedonians, Thessalians. But around this time, Alexander also receives some pretty dire news from Greece. Memnon of Rhodes is sowing dissent between Alexander and the Spartans and Athenians. Not a hard thing for him to do. And Alexander now has the unenviable dilemma of having to choose between East and West, whether he was going to potentially risk losing all his gains in the East in order to preserve his possessions in Macedon and Greece, or just stay in the East, continue pushing onward in this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and not lose any momentum, but then risk everything back home, including the livelihood of his friends and family in Macedon. But it is at this point that Alexander has a dazzling bit of good luck. Memnon dies besieging a settlement in Lesbos, and the Greek campaign sputters out and dies. This resistance movement to Alexander loses all momentum, and the Persians instead decide to concentrate all their attention and all their forces in the east for a decisive engagement, personally led by the great king Darius himself. This time he was going to be present at the battle, unlike at the Granicus. Once again, it was a Greek who counseled caution, who advised against a decisive engagement. This time it was an Athenian mercenary named Charidemus. And this time, the Persians took it even worse. They almost came to blows. Charidemus calls them a bunch of names, and Darius himself grabs Charidemus by the belt and orders his execution. And as Talleyrand much later observed of an altogether different incident, this was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. As for Alexander, he attended to one last bit of business in Gordium, and that is the Gordian Knot. It was named after a farmer called Gordius. This farmer was apparently visited by Zeus in the form of an eagle that landed on his plow. He consulted a local soothsayer, a girl, who helped him make a sacrifice to Zeus, and in the process became his wife. They had a child together named Midas, and Midas became a local favorite, and he rode into town one day on a wagon, and the townspeople took this to be the fulfillment of a prophecy that one day war-torn Phrygia was going to be saved by a guy who came on a wagon, and they figured that was Midas. By the time of Alexander, this wagon was still around, as was its knot. And because you couldn't even tell where the end of the knot was, it was so tangled up, it seemed impossible to unravel. And there are two versions of events from there. According to one, Alexander yanked out the linchpin, so relying a little bit more on cunning. And according to the far more popular version of events, he hacked the knot in two with his sword, relying on force. Which version you believe, I guess, kind of is a Rorschach test of Alexander, whether you buy into him using cunning or force in order to solve the Gordian knot. Alexander proceeds from Gordium to Ancyra through the Taurus Mountains, defeats some token resistance from the local satrap at the Cilician gates, and then outmaneuvers the satrap on the way to Tarsus. And Alexander nearly loses his life in the region of Tarsus because in the sweltering heat, he plunges into the cold waters of the Cydnus River, which is fed by the snow-capped Taurus Mountains, and he might have been sick with malaria at this point. He might have collapsed from pneumonia, but either way, he collapses. His men are all very concerned, and the only doctor that ventures a cure is Philip of Acarnania. And the cure he ventures is rooted in humorism. It would require Alexander to get weaker, possibly to purge himself in some way, shape, or form in order to get stronger. But the concerning thing about this cure was that Parmenion received word that Philip of Acarnania was in the employ or bribed by the great king of Persia and was out to poison Alexander. But Alexander knew Philip of Acarnania since childhood, and as a show of trust, he gave the note to Philip as he drank the medicine that Philip gave him. Both of them seemed unfazed. This was a show of trust. It's an anecdote that illustrates something pretty important about Alexander, I think. He considered trust a two-way street. Even so, Alexander immediately got worse from the cure. So Plutarch reports the effects as follows. Alexander lost his speech, and falling into a swoon, he had scarcely any sense or pulse left, but in no time his health and strength returned. And some scholars have taken this to be evidence of epilepsy, but this is by no means the mainstream consensus. Alexander celebrated his recovery by ordering a silver coin be minted. One side would have Hercules with a lion skin, and the other would have a ball like Zeus, ball being a Phoenician god, and this being an example of the kind of religious syncretism that Alexander championed from Phoenicia to Egypt to India. At Anchialele, Alexander came across a monument erected by the last king of the Assyrian Empire. It had the inscription, Sardanapalus, son of Anaxindaraxes, not a dinosaur, an Assyrian king, built Anchialele and Tarsus in a single day. But you, stranger, eat, drink, and make love, for the lives of other men, compared to mine, are not worth even this. This referring to a snap of his fingers or clap of the hands. This is a little bit reminiscent of the advice that Gilgamesh got during his quest for eternal life, and the inscription has been interpreted as evidence of the hedonism of Sardanapalus, including by Aristotle, who received word of the inscription from Alexander. But to me, the inscription sounds a little bit like Sardanapalus is denying himself the pleasure that he thinks other people are distracting themselves with. You go and indulge in these things, and I'm just going to keep building cities. It's only going to take me a single day to build another city. Anyway, Sardanapalus seems to be a really misrepresented, misunderstood figure with a lot of historiography to drudge through, and could probably be a whole separate video in his own right. Alexander then leaves Cilicia, passes through the Cilician gates into Syria. He is taking the same route as Xenophon, and Darius knows that he's going to do this. He anticipates this and chooses the perfect battlefield on plains that are going to allow him to make use of his superior numbers, especially with regard to cavalry and chariots. And it's going to allow him to envelop the smaller Macedonian army and crush them. But then Darius gets into his own head a little bit because he thinks, wow, there's no way Alexander is going to attack me here. The battlefield is almost too well chosen. And so then he starts going into Silesia. But the problem is that Alexander was crazy enough to actually attack Darius. So then Darius finds himself in Silesia. Alexander finds himself in Syria, and the scouts report, hey, the enemy is behind us. And Darius is rightfully and royally pissed because he had just given up an amazing battlefield for a inferior one. He was now hemmed in between the mountains and the Gulf of Issus. Just as at Thermopylae, the narrowness of the pass neutralized to some extent the superior numbers of the Persians, now the same would happen to a lesser degree at Issus. And so little wonder that Darius, in a fit of rage, executed a bunch of Macedonian Greek prisoners. This brings us to the Battle of Issus, fought in November of 333 BC, and this is the second major battle of Alexander the Great's career. The Persians are supposed to have had 600,000 men according to ancient sources, but this is clearly an exaggeration. It was more like 50 to 100,000 men with 11,000 cavalry. The army was composed of peoples from all across the Achaemenid Empire, and this included the Medes, Tepurians, Armenians, Hyrcani, Barcani, and Greek mercenaries, of course. The Persians also brought along a lot of camp followers, including Darius's own family, and his surroundings were fit for a Sardanapalus, one could say. The Macedonians had much less in the way of camp followers, baggage trains, and whatnot. They were 37,000 men strong, about 5,000 cavalry, marching through rain and cold, and with enemy territory behind them. Their only line of retreat was deeper into the Persian Empire, so they knew they had to stand and fight. The night before the battle, Alexander got very little sleep. He spent the night praying to the gods, and by dawn, he was already at the head of his army, mustering the men. The battle orders and the course of the battle would follow the example of the Granicus quite closely. The only difference was that the odds were worse for the Macedonians. Not in terms of the cavalry, but in terms of the overall numbers. So Alexander positioned his men in the same way. He had cavalry on the wings, Parmenion on the left, Alexander himself on the right, infantry in the center. There was a river that was separating the Persians from the Greeks, in this case the Pinarus, and once again it had steep banks that would make it difficult for the Macedonians to cross. This time the Persians' ranks were also deeper. They had to be deeper as opposed to wider because they were hemmed in by the sea and the mountains, as mentioned previously. The battle begins with the 23-year-old Alexander riding up and down the line on no sleep really over the course of the last 2 days, getting his men excited, getting himself excited to plunge into battle, which he does almost immediately. Again, before the Persians could really react. He is out of bowshot at the time, but then when he does enter bowshot range, he and his cavalry are racing toward the Persians, and they cross the river and provide enough breathing room for the infantry to cross. The Macedonian infantry faces the fiercest resistance from the Greek mercenaries at the center. Meanwhile, Parmenion on the left is engaged by the peerless Persian cavalry. So much has been made of the Thessalian cavalry. The Macedonian companion cavalry as well was an impressive force, but the Persian cavalry was considered the gold standard in the ancient world, at least up until Alexander. And Parmenion's men were getting the worst of it, as would be the case again at Gaugamela. But Parmenion holds his own, and eventually the Macedonian cavalry under Alexander pierces a hole through the line and attacks the Greek mercenaries in the rear, prompting a retreat. Darius stands and does not retreat yet. He is on his war chariot, but then Alexander begins racing toward him, and the scene is captured in the Alexander mosaic from the 2nd century BC, commissioned in Pompeii. And unlike the painting that it was based on, it was preserved by the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius. In this mosaic, Darius regards Alexander with just as much awe as fear, and it's safe to say that that would be pretty accurate representation of his feelings, as Alexander is trying his best to get to the Persian king and fight him in some kind of Homeric honor duel. Darius decides this guy's a lunatic and turns and flees, but leaves his family behind in the process. In the aftermath, Darius' family and all those camp followers and those lavish surroundings belong to Alexander, and he enters Darius' tent, sees very Donald Trump-like interiors. Everything's made out of gold, including the bathtub. There's incense everywhere, and he remarks to his companions, so this is what it's like to be a king. And this tent that served as Darius's headquarters was apparently so big that it was only at dinner time that Alexander noticed the royal family wailing hysterically from another part of the tent. And he sent someone to go calm them down and assure them of their safety. And the next day he goes and sees the royal family himself. And he finds the daughters, the wife, the son of the great king. And before he could announce himself, they throw themselves at his companion's feet, Hephaestion, because he was taller and apparently had a more regal bearing than Alexander. And instead of losing his temper, Alexander just laughs and says that Hephaestion too is another Alexander. And Philip Freeman explains this as being a reflection of the teaching both Alexander and Hephaestion had received from Aristotle as boys, that the truest friend was another self, which I think is a pretty apt description of friendship. Lastly, Alexander founded his first Alexandria in the vicinity of the battlefield. This is arguably the first Alexandria, not the one in Thrace, because the one in Thrace was simply renamed. This one was constructed from the ground up. Darius left the royal treasury in Damascus, or at least part of it, and Alexander then sent Parmenion to go and get it. The over-clever satrap residing in Damascus decided to, at this point, throw his lot in with the Macedonians. He tricked the Persian attendants and royals that were residing in the city to leave it by saying that they would all go and flee to Mesopotamia together. And one of the attendants caught on eventually to what he was doing and killed the satrap, chopped off his head, and presented it to Darius as a gift. But Parmenion was successful in his mission. He was able to requisition all the booty on the thousands of mules filing out of Damascus, and this booty included hundreds of pounds of silver. It included the casket that would give its name to the Iliad of the casket. Basically, it was this box that Alexander would keep his copy of the Iliad in, the one that was annotated personally by Aristotle. And among the hostages were the last Persian king's family, immediate family, as well as the widow and niece of Memnon of Rhodes, Barsine, who was half Persian, half Greek, much like the empire that Alexander was building. And Alexander might have known Barsine from her time at the Macedonian court when she and her family had visited. Alexander at this point fell in love with her. She was about 30 or so. He was into older ladies. She was half Greek, half Persian. And he had a son by her named Hercules, but he never took her as his wife. From there, Alexander proceeded down the Levantine coast through Phoenician lands. He goes to Byblos, which was a trading post between Greece and Egypt. It was a major source of papyrus for the Greeks, informing their word for books, Biblia, as well as various Latinid words after that, as well as the word for Bible. Alexander proceeded from Byblos to Beirut and then to Sidon. Sidon was in need of a king. They had a special requirement, and they insisted upon it that it be a member of their ancient royal line. And eventually the Macedonians found a guy called Abdolonymus, who was a down-on-his-luck, long-lost royal who was a merchant at this point, but because of his honesty, not doing so well as a merchant. And the Macedonians found him tending to his vegetable garden. One thinks of Diocletian and his cabbage patch. And Abdolonymus is in complete disbelief as the Macedonians invite him to meet with their king. He puts on his best clothing. Right away, Alexander likes him because of his humility, and Abdolonymus becomes the new king of Sidon. Alexander then proceeds to Tyre, or Tyre. This was the epicenter of Mediterranean trade. It was the link between East and West, and it was the greatest of the Phoenician cities, the wealthiest, the most prominent. Carthage was, in fact, its daughter city, and the Phoenicians who resided in Tyre, of course, had a long and ancient history. They had come up with the first alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, which informed the Greek alphabet. The Phoenician Aleph, Bet, and Gimel became the Greek Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. As for Tyre itself, it was divided into Old Tyre and New Tyre. New Tyre was an island half a mile from the coast, and it was a delegation from New Tyre that started playing a delicate game with Alexander. Alexander asked to worship and give sacrifice to Hercules at their temple in New Tyre, and the delegation from New Tyre, of course, knew what this meant. It meant that Alexander would basically have free reign to come into the city with his army, impose a garrison, and take it over before proceeding on his way. And to prevent this, they said, couldn't he just go and sacrifice to Hercules in the temple on the mainland in Old Tyre? And Alexander very quickly grew frustrated with this and asked them if they thought they were safe on their island, and said that he was going to prove to them that their island, half a mile from the coast, wasn't really an island at all. And of course, this anecdote benefits from hindsight. Alexander was going to build a massive causeway in order to reach the city and take it over. The Tyrians would resist him, of course, and what followed was a 7-month-long siege, the longest in Alexander's career, the most difficult siege in his career. He was going to have some crazy sieges in the east in lands like Bactria, but this one in Tyre takes the cake. Alexander begins the siege by demolishing Old Tyre for the construction supplies. He sends men to the cedar forests of Lebanon for timber, and he also requisitions supplies from Jerusalem. Over the course of the next few weeks, good progress is made on the causeway, but the Tyrians send their women and children to Carthage and are trying to harass the Macedonians as they are building the causeway with fire arrows and other projectiles. They also send triremes against the causeway, and Alexander builds siege towers that are covered with hides and that archers are stationed on top of in order to counter both the triremes and the projectiles coming from the walls. It's then that the Tyrians hatch a new plan, one that would have devastating consequences for the causeway. They load up a trireme with a bunch of flammable material as well as some sort of incendiary liquid. Then they tow that with a skeleton crew on the ship with a bunch of other triremes, and then send it hurtling toward the causeway. The Phoenician crew jumps out of the ship in the nick of time, swim to safety, and meanwhile the causeway, all the siege towers on it, a bunch of men and supplies all go up in flames, and weeks, if not months of hard work goes down the drain. Alexander then faced a decision. Should he stay or should he go? On one side, this was taking way longer than he expected. He was eager for a decisive engagement with Darius, but for the moment, Darius was still gathering up all the disparate peoples of his empire in order to form an army, and so he had some time there. And Alexander, meanwhile, wanted to deny the Persian fleet, which was still superior in number, any safe harbor along the Mediterranean coast. And on top of that, he just didn't like losing. He didn't like accepting defeat. And so he was not going anywhere. He was going to finish the siege, whatever it took. It's then that the balance of power in the naval theater kind of shifts. A bunch of peoples like the Cypriots and the Phoenicians, other Phoenicians outside of Tyre, defect to the Macedonian Empire, to Alexander, and formerly they had made up the Persian fleet, but now Alexander gains 200 new warships. He also hired 4,000 Greek mercenaries. He had the money now, and he sends an expedition to get more cedar from the mountains. This foraging party encounters Arab raiders, and Alexander decides that he has to go deal with these raiders himself. One of Alexander's former tutors, interestingly, insists on coming along. I guess he was craving a bit of an adventure, but because Lysimachus lagged behind Alexander's party, he stayed behind with him with an even smaller party of men, and this party almost freezes to death come nightfall. But it is then relayed to us that Alexander himself sighted a campfire in the distance and goes full stealth mode. Apparently sneaks into this camp, grabs a burning log, and then brings it to the Macedonians and his tutor that were all huddled together for warmth, and saves his party from freezing to death. So an interesting little side quest for the king of Macedon. And it's safe to say that after that, Lysimachus did not accompany Alexander on any further expeditions. When Alexander returns to Tyre, it is at the head of his armada of 200 warships. They send the Tyrian ships flying back into their harbor, but 3 Tyrian ships sacrifice themselves so that the rest can get away. In the meantime, Alexander's men had also made more progress on the causeway, despite the storms, as well as a whale that flopped on top of it at one point. It's then that Tyre really busts out all the stops, any ingenious defensive tactic that they can come up with, they use. They appeal to Carthage for help, but don't get it. And they try to sally out against the fleet, but Alexander's fleet is too big at this point, and so they have to get creative. One thing they do is pour hot sand onto any soldiers upon the ships that come anywhere near them, and this sand apparently gets in the soldiers' armor and is incredibly painful. Because of this, Alexander's men stop wearing armor, making them more susceptible to Tyrian archer fire. For their part, the Tyrians also have spinning wheels on the walls that are deflecting arrows, apparently. They also have tridents with ropes attached to them to yank shields off ships and make the men on board the ships more susceptible to arrow fire. They throw down fishing nets. They send divers to sabotage the ships and cut the ropes and whatnot. Alexander replaces these ropes with chains, and they also cover the tops of their walls with animal skins and the bottom of their walls with scythes. And so again, they bust out all the stops, but none of it is enough. Eventually, after a period of 7 months, the Macedonians complete the causeway. They reach the walls. The island of Tyre was no longer an island, nor would it ever be. The causeway becomes a permanent fixture of the bay. And after that, it's not an attack from the causeway, but an attack from one of the triremes with a battering ram affixed to it that actually breaches the walls, creates a hole, and then allows a bunch of Macedonian marines to get in. Alexander attacks from the causeway. He is the first on the city walls. The slaughter that follows is comparable or even exceeds that seen in Thebes. Alexander and his men were incredibly angry at the Tyrians. They slaughter much of the city's population. 30,000 are sold to slavery, and then 2,000 are crucified on a beach along the mainland. After Alexander left Tyre, he received another offer of peace from Darius. Darius asked to ransom his family. He said that he would be willing to marry his daughter off to Alexander, and he also this time conceded all lands west of the Euphrates. And on the other hand, he emphasized how difficult it would be to conquer the whole of the empire, especially once he got to Bactria and Sogdiana, which Alexander would eventually find out how hard that would be. What follows is another famous exchange between Parmenion and Alexander. Parmenion tells him that if he were Alexander, he would take the deal, and Alexander said that he would too, if you were Parmenion. He then writes back to Darius saying that he had no shortage of cash, that he could marry his captive daughter whenever he wanted, and that he was coming back for all of it, the entire empire. Alexander then besieges the city of Gaza, which was ruled by a eunuch named Battus, and because the city was well stocked with supplies, reinforced by Arab mercenaries, he refused to surrender. And so Alexander built a mound as tall as the city walls all around the city and brought the siege towers from Tyre to Gaza in order to wheel them on top of the mound. It was then that an eagle dropped a stone on Alexander's head, which was obviously taken to be a very bad omen by Alexander and his soothsayer Aristander. And Aristander told him that he couldn't engage in combat because of this omen. But that very day, the Arabs sallied out, and Alexander just couldn't resist. And shortly after, he takes an arrow to the shoulder, and he gets the wound dressed, and he continues fighting until he is rendered unconscious from the loss of blood. And the Gazans, seeing this, think that Alexander is dead, fooling themselves into believing what they most wanted to believe, as the Greeks had once done. In reality, Alexander was alive and well, and after the siege towers arrived, he personally led the decisive assault that would result in the capture of the city, more killing, more enslavement, as well as the capture of Battus, who, for a eunuch, was very, very proud and refused to render homage to Alexander, earning him a very bloody, one can say, Iliadic punishment. Alexander tied Battus to a chariot, one he probably got from the Battle of Issus, and then dragged him around the city of Gaza until he was dead, and even after that. just as Achilles had done to Hector. In the winter of 332 BC, Alexander arrives in Egypt. He would have gotten all his information about Egypt from Herodotus, who relays some pretty interesting, if factually dubious, claims and stories about this distant land. For example, Herodotus talks about a pharaoh who carried out various human experiments, one of which is eerily reminiscent to one attributed to the medieval Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick II, who we've made a video about in the past. And what this pharaoh does is he takes two infants and he socially isolates them from everybody except the mutes, and this is to determine what mankind's natural language is. Apparently it's Phrygian because the baby's first word was bekos, which is Phrygian for bread, so there's that. Now, the Egyptians weren't exactly fans of Persian rule, contrary to the perception of the Achaemenid Persians as enlightened despots, which might be true in the case of Cyrus and even Darius. Other Achaemenid Persian emperors behaved more like exploiters, Cambyses coming to mind, because this is the Achaemenid emperor who comes into Egypt, takes it over, destroys a bunch of religious sites, slaughters infamously the sacred Apis bull, and eventually Egypt launches an independence revolt. They are reconquered, re-added to the Achaemenid Empire by Artaxerxes III, but obviously this checkered history under Achaemenid rule left a bad taste in the Egyptians' mouths, and they were quick to surrender to Alexander. He had no trouble basically just walking into Egypt, securing control of the treasury, and eventually even being crowned as pharaoh. So in contrast to the Achaemenid emperors, Alexander presented himself very much as a foil to them and was a beacon of tolerance, and embarked on a tour of Egypt, sacrificed to Egyptian gods at the temple of Ptah in the Karnak temple complex in Luxor. Greeks and Egyptians regularly rubbed shoulders during this time in a series of athletic games, plays, feasts, and other such festivities. In the last weeks of 332 BC, Alexander likely went further south. He went to Memphis and maybe even to Egyptian Thebes and Aswan. And then in January 331 BC, Alexander goes and visits the Great Pyramids of Giza, receiving something like an exclusive Mr. Beast style tour of the pyramid complex. It's worth noting that at this point, these pyramids were absolutely ancient to Alexander. They would have been as old to him as Alexander is old to us today. And it was then that Alexander was gripped by this kind of desire, this compulsion, which is referred to by the Greeks as a pothos, something that he is gripped by again and again and led to great feats as a result, sometimes as a warrior, sometimes as an explorer, and sometimes as a city builder. And this time, it was the latter. He had a pothos to found a city. It would end up being the greatest of all the Alexandrias, the one in Egypt on the coast. And this would essentially act as a replacement for New Tyre. It would basically be a new Tyre. It would be a link between East and West. And Alexander was personally involved in plotting the city out. He supposedly laid out its border and where key sites would be with barley. And then another omen, a bunch of birds come and start pecking at the barley and take off with the barley in their beaks. And Alexander obviously thinks this is a bad sign for his city, but Aristander, who's increasingly acting as Alexander's therapist, tells him, no, this means that your city is going to nourish all the nations of the earth. And even if that was a bit of a stretch, it is true that Alexandria would be of critical significance to the Roman Empire, and Egypt as a whole would act as the empire's breadbasket. Alexander then travels 300 miles west of the Nile Valley across the Sahara Desert to visit a place called Siwa, which was home to a temple of Zeus Amun. Zeus and Amun were equivalents in the Greek and Egyptian pantheons respectively, and Amun gave his name to ammonia because of the rock salts in the region of Siwa. And this temple serves to remind us that even though Alexander is seen as this huge religious, cultural, syncretizing force, there was already a long history of syncretism between the Greeks and Egyptians. So Herodotus points out that there are actually numerous instances of Greek religious practices ultimately deriving from Egyptian ones. There was a Greek colony at Cyrene in Libya, and there was frequent trade between the Greeks and Egyptians. As we know, they got their papyrus from Egypt at Byblos and other places. And in Athens, there was even a temple erected to Amun. And then in Thebes, Pindar sang songs in praise of this Egyptian god. What's more, Alexander's ancestor Hercules as well as Perseus both visited the temple. And so Alexander decided he simply had to go and see it for himself. But again, this was nuts. It was highly irrational to go and trek through the Sahara Desert during a time of war. Even though Darius was gathering a mighty host for a decisive battle, the war in the Aegean had not yet been won. Macedonians were actively taking control of the Aegean at this time. Something could have gone wrong, but Alexander kind of throws caution to the wind, as he does so many times, says that he was going to deal with it later if something came up, and goes and treks through the Sahara Desert with his men, gets lost, runs out of water, then is only saved by a rainstorm. And so that solves his party's water issue for the moment, but they're still lost. And according to legend, they only find their way to Siwa by being guided by snakes or ravens. One way or another, though, they eventually do make it out of the desert and arrive in Siwa. And then at Siwa, Alexander doesn't go and see anybody, isn't hosted by anybody, doesn't stop to see any of the sights. He goes straight to the soothsayers. And one soothsayer, while addressing him, says, "Oh, my child," which translates to Opaidion in Greece. Because of his accent, it comes out Opaidos. And Alexander, in his mind, hears Opaidios, which means, "O child of Zeus." In his mind, this is confirmation of his divinity. He then asks the soothsayers 3 questions: whether he was going to defeat Persia, whether Philip's killers were dead, and then whether Philip was actually his father. And we can't ever know for certain what their answers were, but we do know that Alexander, shortly after his visit, writes to his mother telling her that he had very important news that he could only share with her in person. And he also begins minting coins with his likeness, with ram's horns protruding out of his head, a sign of divinity. According to one account, the soothsayers told him that his true father could not be killed, but that in any case, Philip's killers had all been brought to justice, and they also tell Alexander that he was destined to rule the world. It was now time for Alexander to go back to Memphis. Again, he opts for the most dangerous path imaginable, a trek through the desert, 300 miles, and again he runs out of water, but eventually makes it back. The whole trip to Siwa and back had taken about a month, but in Alexander's mind that was probably a good bargain, a good use of his time, because he left a man and he returned a god. Leaving Egypt, Alexander would do something he did in other satrapies. He divided power to prevent a serious threat to his rule, and off he goes to Mesopotamia. Now, on the way to Mesopotamia, Alexander learns that the people of Samaria, hardly acting like good Samaritans, had burnt his satrap alive and declared independence. And so he pursues them up the mountains. They hide in a cave. The offenders include men, women, and children, and are then slaughtered indiscriminately. So this was another example of harsh and grisly Alexandrine justice. Alexander then appoints a new satrap of Samaria, of course. He stops in Tyre, which was being rebuilt and repopulated, and then he shows another side of himself with his friend Harpalus, who had stolen from the treasury and then absconded to Greece, but now gets his job back. So Alexander was, at the end of the day, only human, and he had a soft spot for his friends. Now, it was 500 miles from Tyre to Alexander's destination, Babylon, as the crow flies, but the practical route from Tyre to Babylon was about twice that distance, so about 1,000 miles. And it was also summertime, so the march was going to be hot. So perhaps because of the heat, the camp followers start to get rowdy and start brawling, and the brawl gets increasingly violent. Instead of dividing themselves into into shirts and skins. They divide themselves into Persians and Greeks, and eventually Alexander has to go and put a stop to this brawl. Otherwise, it was going to affect his troops as well, and he was going to lose control of the army. And so he comes up with the solution of bringing the mock Alexander and mock Darius before him and having them fight to the death. And Alexander, unplanned, wins the honor duel and then is appointed governor of 12 villages as a reward. So imagine living in one of those 12 villages and finding out that the guy who was going to be your governor is only governor because he had successfully LARPed as Alexander. I mean, this is another interesting aspect, let's say, of Alexander's governance strategy. By August, Alexander reached the Euphrates River. He had sent Hephaestion ahead with the engineering corps in order to build a pontoon bridge. Hephaestion was increasingly Alexander's second in command. He was his boyhood friend, some say even more than that, and he was equal parts confidant, soldier, and engineer. So he was a real boon to Alexander. And he wisely left the last segment of the pontoon bridge unfilled. This was to prevent the Persians from rushing Hephaestion's forward force before Alexander arrived with the bulk of the army. And meanwhile, on the other side of the Euphrates, the Persians with their cavalry force were scorching earth, because what they were counting on is Alexander crossing the pontoon bridge and then proceeding south along the Euphrates straight to Babylon, just like Xenophon did. But this is the thing about Alexander. He's unpredictable, and he had followed Xenophon pretty religiously up to this point, but now he breaks with Xenophon's strategy, and instead he marches toward the Tigris. So Freeman is great on this. He says that the great king expected Alexander to behave like any rational general and lead his army along a well-watered and established road. Instead, the Macedonian king was making a long, slow detour in the wrong direction, that direction being toward the Tigris. But this wasn't just unpredictability. It can also be argued that Alexander didn't want to put up with the resistance of the well-fortified river cities along the Euphrates. He would rather just take supplies from the undefended villages on the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Either way, it worked out because, again, the Persians had scorched earth, the banks along the Euphrates, and so Alexander would have had a hard time getting supplies. Now, none of this is to say that the Persians could not adapt in turn. It's just that for them, turning their army was more like turning a tanker. They had a massive host. It would be 2 years from Issus to Gaugamela. Also, they were beefing up their cavalry forces and really determined to fight a battle on the plains where they could make use of their superior numbers and cavalry and completely envelop the Macedonians. And they were also making longer spears to counter the Sarissa. When Alexander reaches the Tigris, he decides not to make a bridge. Instead, he wades into the water. He is chest high in the water. He encourages his troops to follow, but they're a little bit hesitant because they don't want to lose their loot. So they're trying to hold their loot up above the water, put it on their heads. Alexander assures them that he is going to recoup any of their losses, and eventually he gets them to link arms together in order to stem the current of the river, and he also stations some horsemen upriver in order to stem the current further. Now, the very next day, just after they cross the Tigris, on the eve of this momentous battle that everyone knows is coming, there is a lunar eclipse, and the moon becomes a blood red. And even in this ancient time, Alexander probably knew enough astronomy to know that this was simply the Earth, the sun, and the moon coming into alignment, but his troops sure as hell did not know that. Alexander, in order to reassure them, brings out Aristander, and together they convinced the troops that this was simply a sign that the Macedonians would eclipse, pun fully intended, the Persians. It is now September 331 BC, and this month brings the Battle of Gaugamela, the greatest battle in history up to that point. It begins with a cavalry skirmish between the Macedonian-aligned Paeonians and the Persians. The Paeonians come out successful, and the captured Persians reveal that Darius is very close by, just beyond the hills in the vicinity of the town of Gaugamela. Gaugamela, translated to Camel's House, this was in honor of the camel of a bygone king who fled to safety on this camel to what would become Gaugamela, and then ordered the local villagers to care for it for the rest of its life. And it was here that Darius chose his battlefield. It wasn't perfectly flat, but but then Darius began terraforming it so that it was, cutting down trees, filling in holes, and completely flattening it in order to make use of his cavalry most effectively. Alexander, being the aggressor, is the one to close the distance during the night. The Persians, meanwhile, are sending agents to his camp, trying to turn the soldiers away from Alexander. As a show of trust, Alexander wanted to read one of their offers, which was a bribe of some sort, publicly to the assembled army, and Parmenion wisely counsels against this because apparently the bribe was pretty good. Alexander also listens to Parmenion in a first by deciding not to rush the enemy immediately as he had at the Granicus and Issus. This time he reconnoiters the battlefield and gathers some intelligence before retiring for the night. Parmenion then, in a surprise twist, comes to Alexander in the dead of night and encourages boldness and says that they should surprise the Persians and take them unawares during the night. To which Alexander, in a brave but seemingly brainless reply, says, "I don't steal victories." This is a little reminiscent of his thought process before the Granicus when he said that he didn't want the Persians to think that he was afraid of them. This is similar logic in some ways, but there was another reason why he might have given this reply to Parmenion. The fact of the matter is that during antiquity, night battles were huge gambles. Imagine how confusing an ancient battle was in the first place. Now add the cover of darkness. Alexander was a gambler, but daytime battles had worked out just fine for him, so why risk a nighttime battle at this decisive moment in the campaign? Plus, Alexander had arguably an even better idea. He was going to simply let the Persians think that he was going to attack at the night. How exactly he does this is a little unclear, but one way or another, Alexander keeps a portion of the Persian army awake through the night, making them weary the next morning, while his own troops are fresh for the battle. As for Alexander himself, he stays up late into the wee hours until he comes up with a stratagem for the next day, at which point he falls into a deep sleep, oversleeps breakfast, sleeps in late until Parmenion barges into his tent and finally asks him how he could be so soundly asleep when the greatest battle in history was taking place the next day, to which Alexander replied, "Don't you know that we've already won?" Alexander then ate, dressed, sacrificed to the gods, and told his men the plan. In a nutshell, what he was going to do is shift all his forces to the right, making like he was going to flank around Darius' army. And then the hope was that Darius would mirror his movements, create a gap in his line that Alexander and his companion cavalry would exploit. The Macedonian side for this battle had 50,000 men. This included the Thracians, the Thessalians, other allied peoples, and they had 7,000 cavalry. The Persians had 100,000 men. This was their largest army yet, and this army included all their subject peoples like the Bactrians, the Scythians, the Medes, Arabs, Babylonians, Armenians, Syrians, Cappadocians, and of course the Greek mercenaries, plus a dozen or so war elephants, the first time any Greek or Macedonian army had to face these beasts in battle. Wouldn't be the last time though. And the Persians also had hundreds of scythed chariots from India. Plus they had 30,000 cavalry, so over 4 times as many as the Macedonians. As for the battle orders, Darius was in the center, leaning toward the right. His satrap Bessus was on the left, and his satrap Mazaeus was on the right. On the Macedonian side, it was same old, Parmenion on the left with the Thessalian cavalry. In the center, the Sarissas, this time with Greek mercenaries behind them, and on the right, Alexander with the companion cavalry. Alexander begins the battle as usual, riding up and down the line on an aged but still spirited Bucephalus. Alexander's whole army then begins shifting toward the right, and Darius gives Alexander what he wants. And part of the reason why is that Darius doesn't want Bessus being baited too far to Alexander's right, the Persians left, and leave this carefully terraformed plain and venture into the more rocky terrain off to the side of the battlefield. And so what happens is that Bessus engages Alexander. Alexander slowly gains the upper hand. Meanwhile, the main Persian assault happens on the Macedonian left. The scythed chariots are sent in. Alexander, in the lead up to the battle, had been training his men on how to deal with it. So they throw their javelins, they try to grab the rider's reins, and they also sidestep. wasn't completely foolproof as a strategy. If you were slow on your feet, you might have had your legs chopped off by the scythes, but for the most part, it was probably okay. At this point, the scythed war chariots are a little outdated. The real damage to the Macedonian left is being done by the Persian cavalry. Parmenion and his men are holding out against impossible odds, but somehow they stand firm. In this instance and others, Parmenion basically is to Alexander what the Marshal Davout is to Napoleon. And at this point, Alexander peels off from Bessus with a portion of his companion cavalry and charges the Persian center straight at Darius in a wedge-shaped formation. And if there was a time for a heroic last stand, it was now, but Darius instead, seeing Alexander charging him just as he had at the Battle of Issus, retreats. And remember, Parmenion and his men were up against impossible odds. They were about to be overwhelmed, so Alexander had to go and ride to his relief instead of chasing after Darius. So the slippery Persian king escapes once again. Now, just because Darius retreated from Gaugamela didn't mean that he was finished. He went to the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, and it is from these lands that he planned to fight a guerrilla campaign against Alexander. And he got his men all excited about turning to the old ways of the Achaemenids and fighting as their ancestors had. But the problem increasingly was that his men did not prove to be the men that their ancestors were. They had grown quite accustomed, quite used to the luxuries and comforts of life in the Persian Empire. Alexander, meanwhile, is heading south toward Babylon along the Tigris River. Along the way, he encounters bitumen, hydrocarbon, so product of crude oil. In those days, it wasn't used as fuel, but more so as a sealing agent for boats, even for baskets. So bitumen is used in the Sargon birth legend for Sargon of Akkad. But the people of Alexander's day did know that bitumen was highly flammable. And so while he's journeying to Babylon, some villagers that he comes across put on a light show involving bitumen. And Alexander is so curious about this liquid that he has one of his servants rub it all over him and then sets him alight. And the poor servant does survive, but probably with third-degree burns. So not Alexander's finest moment. Like, obviously, he was going to burn to death or get pretty close to that. Upon arriving at Babylon, the satrap Mazaeus defects to Alexander's side. Remember, this is the guy who was commanding the Persian right at Gaugamela. And because of this, Alexander is able to take Babylon without bloodshed. Now, even then, past its prime, Babylon was a magnificent grid-like city. Alexander and his men passed through the Ishtar Gates, or one of the dozens or hundreds of bronze gates around the city. This was a city with silk from China and amber from the Baltic. Its patron god was Bel-Marduk, who had a ziggurat tall enough to require a rest stop halfway in between. Then at the top of the ziggurat was a bed, and on this bed, a woman from the city slept. She was the appointed bride of Bel-Marduk for that night. And it was at the Temple of Ishtar that every Babylonian woman at some point in her life had to make herself available to the citizenry. So any man, regardless of social class or distinction, could come up to her and then pay a fee in order to sleep with her. And the priests at the temple would accept this fee as a donation. The Greeks looked at this as citywide enforced prostitution, but to the Babylonians, it was an important tradition, and also a fleeting moment when class distinctions melted away, even if only for a single night. The only discriminating factor was beauty, and so unfortunately there were some women who had to wait years and were forced to just stay at the temple for that duration of time, I guess. There were, of course, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as well. This was a little bit like the ancient Taj Mahal. An Assyrian king brought in piped water, tons and tons of dirt and trees and plants, all in a bid to impress his wife, who missed her forested homeland. And the Hanging Gardens were one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. There's a case to be made, because in Alexander's day, only 5 of those wonders had been built, that he got to visit every single wonder that had up to that point been constructed. So obviously he saw the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, he saw the Great Pyramid of Giza, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, presumably, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, and then the Colossus of Rhodes and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. those last two had not yet been built. Another interesting thing about Babylon was that people would leave their sick and dying on the street, so they didn't trust doctors, but they did trust the advice of all the people coming and going, because chances are that somebody would have a cure or a remedy from somewhere far away. And it's important to mention that in Babylon, as in Egypt, the Persians weren't exactly popular. So Xerxes had seized a statue of Bel-Marduk from the temple. He then had the priests who defended the statue killed, and the temple was eventually destroyed. So Alexander set himself up once again as a foil to the Achaemenid Persians, a beacon of tolerance. He had this same temple renovated and made all sorts of sacrifices to Bel-Marduk. He also visited Chaldean soothsayers, and some of these accompanied him on his future journeys. Besides their skills in astronomy, astrology, divination, the Chaldeans came up with the base 60 numerical system, giving us the 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, and the 360-degree circle. More broadly, the Babylonians also pioneered complex fractions, quadratic equations, and even the Pythagorean theorem, which the Greeks then built on because of this encounter, so because of Alexander. And so because of all these sights to see and people to meet, the Persians were counting on Alexander idling his time away in Babylon. But even though his men were perfectly happy to do that and spend their time at the Babylonian pleasure houses, Alexander, meanwhile, was in the palace banning dessert, concerned about his men going soft, and very quickly he set out to capture the treasuries of Susa and Persepolis. Because Susa was closer, Alexander headed in that direction first, passing through the ancient land of Sumer. Formerly, Susa was the capital of the Elamite Empire, the Elamites being a very ancient people like the Sumerians, and Elamite being an official language of the Persian Empire, just as it now would be an official language of Alexander's empire. At the Great Palace of Susa, Alexander found two statues hauled off by Xerxes during his invasion of Greece. These statues were returned to Athens, where they came from, and when Alexander went to sit down on the throne, he found that he was too short for it. His feet didn't quite touch the ground, and so a footstool was brought for him, and this footstool happened to be Darius's dining table. Meanwhile, Darius's family, who had accompanied Alexander all this way, were back in their quarters. Alexander sends them some weaving material, and they take this as a grave insult. They weren't slaves, why would they be weaving? And Alexander had to explain to them that back in his country, in Macedonia, it was normal for noblewomen to weave. Even his mother and sister did it. The Great Palace was flanked by numerous smaller palaces, including one built by Artaxerxes II. This palace had an inscription containing the word Paradayadam, which informed the later Persian word and the later Greek word that gave us our word paradise. As for the treasury of Susa, it was found to contain 40,000 talents of silver and gold, as well as thousands of darics. These were coins depicting Darius the Great as an archer. From Susa, Alexander proceeded up the Zagros Mountains to Persepolis. He encountered the Euxines, who were mountain-dwelling relatives of the Persian kings, but despite their kinship, these were semi-autonomous free agents that levied tolls even on Persian armies. Alexander, however, was not about to pay a toll. And remember that the Macedonians were a mountain-dwelling people themselves, so Alexander took his best men and hiked up a mountain trail led by some Susan guides. They proceed to slaughter every Euxine village they come across. Alexander then confronts the main force. He has a detachment of his men block their retreat and leaves very few survivors. The remaining Euxines are only spared through the intercession of Darius's mother, and Alexander then levies tribute on them. They are forced to give him a bunch of riding animals and grazing animals. And what this meant, as Philip Freeman wrote, is that in mere days, Alexander and his men had done what the Persian Empire was unable to accomplish in 200 years. And this had been Alexander's modus operandi since the Danube. He would attack. The Persians in that 200-year span might have figured that the Euxines weren't worth the time or the trouble, but Alexander just had no such calculus. If somebody challenged his authority, then he would simply squash them. It didn't matter how small or impoverished or how barbaric people he came across, he was going to attack And in all likelihood, in the long term, this was a deterrent strategy. This allowed him to take over the remnants of the Achaemenid Empire much faster than it might have otherwise taken. Alexander's next obstacle was the defenders at the Persian gates. They guarded the direct route to Persepolis. There was a longer indirect route that Alexander sent Parmenion on, but he himself took the direct route, of course. And here Philip writes that this was not a plan any reasonable general would have attempted, but once again, Alexander was not a reasonable general. For once, though, splitting his forces and attacking with a smaller force, this impetuous approach did not pay off for Alexander. The defenders of the Persian gates, led ably by the satrap, are able to repel Alexander, and he loses hundreds of Macedonians. And at that point, he has to decide whether he was going to follow Parmenion, take the indirect route, or try to negotiate a truce with the defenders at the gates and collect his dead and give them proper funeral rites. But it is then that he has a lucky break. During the attack, the Macedonians took a prisoner, a Lycian shepherd who spoke Greek, and he told them of a narrow sheep path that led to the Persian gates, but he warned them that this was not a path fit for an army. But Alexander was someone who, when told something was impossible, was all the more likely to attempt it. Plus, he apparently recalled a prophecy in which he was told that a wolf was going to lead him into the Persian Empire, and the Greek word for wolf was lycos, which was uncannily similar to Lykios or Lycian, and this was, again, a Lycian shepherd. So Alexander tells the main force to light enough fires to make the Persians not think anything was remiss, and then he takes some of his best men. They take 3 days worth of provisions, and they brace themselves for what was going to be the hardest climb of their lives, at least up until that point. During the way, they were chest deep in the snow, very hazardous terrain, and they have to be quiet the whole time so as not to alert anybody. Then at the summit of the mountain, Alexander splits his men again. A part of them go directly down the mountain, and then another detachment led by Alexander himself go to the absolute rear of the enemy and attack there, then blow their trumpets, and all the Macedonians, all 3 detachments, then attack simultaneously and storm the Persian gates. The satrap is able to slip away, but at some point during Alexander's advance to Persepolis, he is killed. The Lycian shepherd was richly rewarded, the Macedonian fallen were given proper funeral rites, and the road to Persepolis now lay open. On his way to Persepolis, Alexander comes across a pitiful, macabre procession of Greek exiles, all of whom had been mutilated in some way, and they served as an example of what happened if you resisted the great kings of Persia. And Alexander was so moved by the sight that he began weeping, and he ensured that these exiles would be treated with all due respect, and he took care of them for the rest of their lives. Alexander and his men received a very different kind of reception at Persepolis, especially compared to Babylon and these other satrapies that were unhappy with Persian rule. In entering Persepolis, he was very conscious of entering the heart of the Persian Empire. This had formerly been a tent town until Darius the Great built it up and left an inscription reading as follows: I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of nations, king on this wide earth. I built this fortress as Ahura Mazda and all the gods with him willed it. I built it, completed it, made it beautiful and secure, exactly as I determined. And the locals were quite afraid at the sight of Alexander and his army, and as we will see, they had every right to be. Alexander had contained his men long enough. They had not sacked Babylon, but they would sack Persepolis. And all the kinds of scenes that we witnessed in Thebes, in Tyre, now unfolded here in the heart of the Persian Empire in Persepolis. And some of the residents, we are told, donned their finest clothing, took their families up to their roofs, and threw themselves off of it to their death rather than fall into the hands of the Macedonians. Only the palace complex was spared, at least for now. At the great palace of Persepolis, Alexander once again mounted the throne, which he was once again too short for, but the scene was stirring enough, at least to Demaratus of Corinth, for him to break into tears. This was the culmination of all his dreams and Philip's dreams, as well as Alexander's. The treasury of Persepolis was promptly secured and then shipped off on thousands of mules to Susa. That way Alexander could concentrate all of his wealth in one place. And he also shipped off the treasury of Pasargadae, which he visited next. This was the site where Cyrus defeated the Medes. It became a coronation site for Persian kings. They would, in the traditional mode, eat fig cake, chew turpentine wood, and drink sour milk, which were all reminders of their rough and hardy origins as mountain warriors. There, Alexander visited the tomb of Cyrus, which had a much humbler inscription than the one of Darius the Great in Persepolis. It read, "Mortal man, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, founder of the Persian Empire and king of Asia. Do not begrudge me this small monument." And this was an episode that I find reminiscent of Napoleon after the War of the Fourth Coalition when he defeated Prussia, then visiting Frederick the Great's tomb and remarking to his marshals that they might not be standing there if Frederick the Great had still been alive. And Alexander was so moved by the tomb of Cyrus that he ordered it restored and protected from that point onward. We will see if he lived up to that pledge. For the next 5 months, Alexander lets his men have some RR&R in the ruins of Persepolis, but he himself, being characteristically restless, sets off into the mountains on what is essentially a human hunting expedition. Those of his men who accompany him take one look at the jagged, snow-tipped peaks and try to convince him to turn back, to which Alexander jumps off his horse, grabs an ice pick, and begins hacking away at the ice himself. They then proceed to kill some unnamed tribe, which, just like the Marmaris in Anatolia, just like the Persians in Persepolis, begin killing their own so that they wouldn't fall to the Macedonians. And Alexander then turned his attention to the cave-dwelling Mardi people who did not kill their own because this was a more egalitarian society where even the women fought. They had slings that bound their hair so that they could use these slings during times of combat, but all the same, Alexander and his men killed the men and women alike before returning to Persepolis. Everybody who accompanied the king gets various gifts and mementos, and they would remember this gruesome hunting expedition for the rest of their lives. And it is at this point that we come to an even more infamous and far more well-known episode from Alexander's life, that being the burning of the palace of Persepolis. So again, Alexander and some of his best men had just come from this hunting expedition, and they were at a party. Everybody was very drunk, so the whole thing might have been a drunken accident. However, the blame has also been pinned on an Athenian courtesan named Thais, a hetera, basically a high-class escort, who had shacked up with Ptolemy. She would later become his wife and bear him children. And she apparently stirred the crowd with a call for revenge against the great king. She was an Athenian, and Xerxes had burnt down the Acropolis during his invasion, and so she now called on everybody present to return the favor and burn down the palace of Persepolis. And she even managed to convince Alexander, apparently, who grabbed a torch and joined in. But almost right away, Alexander seems to have regretted it and called for his men to put out the flames. At that point, it was too late, though. And Alexander changing his mind about burning down the palace squares with an earlier account given by Plutarch, which has him coming across a toppled statue of Xerxes and remarking, "Shall I pass by and leave you lying there because of the expeditions you led against Greece? Or shall I set you up again because of your magnanimity and your virtues in other respects?" Now, Alexander did promise Darius that he would chase him to the ends of the earth, and now he made good on that pledge. Darius was hundreds of miles away in Ecbatana with a pitiful force of 10,000, and ironically, some of the last to be by his side were Greek mercenaries. Alexander set out with his men at a blistering pace, covering 20 miles per day, very fast considering the terrain conditions, and he also made some moves against Parmenion. So while this game of cat and mouse was taking place between Alexander and Darius, there was another game of cat and mouse taking place internally in the Macedonian camp between Alexander and the septuagenarian Parmenion. Parmenion was 70-something at this point, and the Thessalians' contracts their forced service came to an end, and they now elected, most of them elected to stay as paid volunteers. But what this meant for Alexander was that they would answer to him directly, no longer to Parmenion, who, as you'll recall, led them on the left wing of basically every battle and was the guy they answered to up until this point. And in the same stroke, Alexander sends Parmenion off to secure the treasury at Ecbatana, which Darius had evacuated since Alexander began his march, and thereby sidelined Parmenion in these two ways. Alexander then got news that the satrap Bessus, who had commanded the Persian left flank at Gaugamela, was the satrap of Bactria, had captured Darius. And he did not want that because Bessus would be a formidable adversary if he usurped the crown from Darius, which he proceeded to do. So Alexander then advances even more rapidly. He splits off a force of 500 cavalry. He is at its head. They take another desert route, a hazardous crossing, which they take at night, covering 50 miles during that night. And at this point, Alexander's legend was such that when they intercept Bessus, and his force being considerably larger, Bessus flees, and during his panicked retreat, he stabs Darius. And in the chaos of it all, the wagon that was carrying Darius and the horses that were pulling this wagon were wounded, and the wagon ends up crashing into an oasis. A Macedonian named Polystratus then comes across this oasis, apparently being very thirsty, scooping up some water in his helmet, and then he sees the wagon. And taking a peek inside, he sees 2 dead slaves, as well as Darius barely alive. One would like to imagine that Polystratus then gave him a drink of water as Darius passed from this life to the next, and that Alexander might have even been present. According to some accounts, he was. What we know with greater certainty is that Alexander eventually comes across his body, weeps at the sight of it, and wraps Darius in his own cloak. It was all supposed to be very different. He imagined Darius giving him his daughter's hand in marriage, retiring to some country estate under a Macedonian guard, of course, and the empire peaceably transitioning from one great king to the next. So this was something of a Caesarian reaction from Alexander. It was like Caesar coming across the head of Pompey in Egypt. Alexander now had an even better claim to the title of Great King, but he did have to deal with Bessus. But as far as Alexander's troops were concerned, their job was now over. So Alexander had to give them a bit of a pep talk. He greatly overestimated the danger posed by Bessus and underestimated how much work it would take to tame the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. He also sweetened the deal with a pay raise. And so he and his men journey to Hyrcania, the breadbasket of the Persian Empire. There, Alexander receives a delegation of Persian nobles who surrender to him. Some of these nobles were implicated in the death of Darius, and they were only saved from Alexander's wrath by the intercession of a eunuch named Bagoas, who Alexander apparently took a liking to and then took on as a lover, according to some accounts. According to legend, Alexander also now met Thalestris, the queen of the Amazons. These were warrior women whose name Amazon meant no breast because they cut off a breast in order to throw a javelin more effectively. And the Amazons were only interested in men insofar as they could copulate with them. And in the Amazonian twist, they would abandon the male infants and raise the female infants into warrior women. And so Thalestris is supposed to have spent 13 nights with Alexander, apparently trying to conceive the greatest warrior in history, and is then supposed to have left satisfied. Even the ancient historians Plutarch and Diodorus take issues with this story, and then a contemporary of Alexander, Lysimachus, later is told this tale, and he was present in Hyrcania at this time and is supposed to have remarked, "Where was I when all of this happened?" While in Hyrcania, there was a group known as the Mardi, the Caspian Mardi, no relation to the Mardi around Persepolis, who screwed up in a big way. They unwittingly stole Bucephalus. Alexander goes on a rampage, and they quickly back off, return the horse, but he takes some hostages for good measure. Alexander and his men then proceed to Parthia, the birthplace of a future empire that would be the contemporary of the Roman Empire. Alexander is slowly assuming more and more of the kit and caboodle of the Achaemenid kings, including a white sash, a diadem. He has a eunuch lover, and he also has a harem of 365 concubines, which apparently he actually does not pay that much attention to. The satrap of Asia that he appointed defected to Bessus, so Alexander, in a rage, rides 70 miles in 2 days, corners him in some forested slope, has his men cut down all the trees in the vicinity, then make a big mound of logs all around, set them aflame so that the satrap's men on the slope would choke in the smoke, and predictably they try to escape the smoke and run out and are then killed by Alexander's men. Alexander then founds the first Central Asian Alexandria, the Alexandria of the Arians, but this was already a settlement, so he really renamed it. And he also receives 7,000 fresh reinforcements from Antipater and Macedon, including 2,000 Lydian cavalry this time. It's at this point that the game of cat and mouse between Alexander and Parmenion also reaches a grisly conclusion. There had been a death in Parmenion's family, leaving his son Philotas as the last member of the Parmenion faction to remain at Alexander's side. Remember, Parmenion had been sent to Ecbatana. Philotas was a brave and capable but pompous soldier, and he was supposed to have bragged to his concubine Antigone that Alexander owed all of his success to him and his father Parmenion. And so Antigone got to chatting with her friends, they got to chatting with their friends, and eventually word reached Alexander. He interviews Antigone, and henceforth she becomes his spy. But she doesn't find any more incriminating evidence against Philotas, so Alexander uses a separate incident entirely, whereby a guy called Dimnus tried to assassinate him, then tells his male lover that he was going to assassinate Alexander, who then tells somebody else, who then tells Philotas, who does not tell Alexander. So Philotas is guilty of the sin of omission, which can be explained on the basis of him not taking this plot seriously, or having a more malicious intent of letting it happen. Either way, Alexander is none too pleased. He arrests Philotas and then tortures him to death. And knowing how Parmenion would react, he then dispatches a party of his most loyal Macedonians to go and kill Parmenion. It is now the end of 330 BC, and Alexander is still hunting Bessus down. He crosses the Hindu Kush during the winter. These are the biggest mountains that the Macedonians have seen. They get altitude sickness while traveling along the Helmand River. After descending, Alexander founds 2 more Alexandrias, one along the Helmand River in modern-day Afghanistan, which would become Kandahar, and another called Alexandria in the Caucasus. And this was nowhere near the Caucasus Mountains, but in those days, the Hindu Kush was called the Caucasus Indicus. While proceeding through the Khawak Pass, 12,000 feet above sea level, Alexander hears from the local guides a story that is uncannily reminiscent of the story of Prometheus, a story involving a god who steals fire from his kindred deities. And in Alexander's mind, what this meant was that he really was at the ends of the earth now, and the whole thing was kind of fitting because the guy who saved Prometheus from his cruel fate was Hercules, Alexander's ancestor. By this point, Bessus had retreated across the Oxus River with the lord of the Sogdians, Spitamenes, and so Alexander followed him into Sogdia. But what this meant was that where just a little while ago his men were dying of the cold, now they were dying of thirst traversing through the sand dunes. In one of those endearing anecdotes, one of his guides got some water for his sons, but then came across Alexander, and seeing the king, offered the water he had gathered to him, but Alexander said, "No, just go give it to your sons." When Alexander and his men finally reached the Oxus River, fed as it was by the cold waters of the Pamir Mountains, they couldn't contain themselves and they began drinking exorbitant amounts. and some of them began throwing up. Some of them even died from consuming too much. Alexander then sends some of the sick and old veterans back home, and presumably some of these were disillusioned by recent events with Parmenion. Those who remain then cross not with a bridge, but with the good old Xenophon technique that Alexander busted out in the Danube. They fill their tents with pitch and then fold them up and use them as flotation devices to get across the Oxus River. And this was fitting because just like after crossing the Danube, they found themselves in uncharted territory. Now the vast grassy fields of the Asian steppe stretched out before them, a thoroughly unfamiliar sight to the mountain men of Macedon. They then come across a pretty familiar sight, though, in the form of fellow Greeks, the Branchidae, who came from Asia Minor and were sent to Sogdia by Xerxes, not out of punishment. This wasn't like the mutilated Greeks outside Persepolis, but rather for their own protection. You see, they had been Persian collaborators, and so Alexander now had to decide what to do with them. And after consulting with his officers, the next morning he proceeds to slaughter these Greeks, men, women, children alike, all protesting their fates in Greek. Not even their sacred grove was spared, with the trunks being uprooted in the aftermath. In the meantime, Spitamenes decided to turn on Bessus and deliver him to Alexander, and before he could get cold feet, Alexander sent Ptolemy to retrieve Bessus. Alexander then has Bessus tied up to a pole naked. He questions him as to his decisive role in the death of Darius, and apparently unhappy with the answers, he has his ears and nose mutilated before turning Bessus over to Darius' family in Ecbatana, who inflicted what was probably the most horrifying death imaginable. In the end, though, it would be the Lord of the Sogdians, Spitamenes, who proved Alexander's most capable and slippery foe. During one skirmish that Alexander personally takes part in, he is shot in the right leg. He breaks his fibula. The infantry and cavalry then argue over who has the right to carry Alexander on the stretcher, and Alexander settles the feud by telling them that they could alternate days. He then founds Alexandria the farthest. This was meant to be a launching pad against the Scythians. This guy was crazy. He was never going to stop. And just like Cyrus, he intended to conquer the Scythians. A bunch of Macedonians are even sent to Scythia as guests, ostensibly, but really they are gathering intel. He was intent on making peace with the Sogdians, however. He tried to meet with Spitamenes, but Spitamenes was suspicious. And as Philip Freeman writes, often in the ancient world, such settings were a prelude to arrest or murder of the guests. The Sogdians had no way of knowing. This was not Alexander's style. He might ride 50 miles in a night to kill them all in their beds, but he would never violate the sacred duty of a host. As such, all of Sogdiana rose up in revolt. They slaughter all the Macedonian garrisons. Alexander proceeds to take them back one by one, but at one of these cities, Serapolis, named after Cyrus because he died nearby fighting the Scythians, a large stone is dropped on Alexander's head. He loses consciousness, but then he regains his senses and gets up to show his men that he is still alive. At the same time, the Scythians start raiding his territory, so Alexander prepares a bunch of hide boats and prepares to cross the Jaxartes. And he and his men do this and chase the Scythians, but run out of water and then resort to drinking from puddles, which gets them sick with dysentery. Elsewhere near Samarkand, a force of Macedonians not led by Alexander was also defeated, further emboldening the Scythians and Sogdians alike. And the Sogdian ulcer would swell further. This guerrilla war would rage on, because in those days, the plains could be just as deadly as the mountains for the purpose of waging a guerrilla war. You just had to use horses and deploy hit-and-run tactics. Slowly, however, the tide began to turn in favor of the Macedonians. Nearchus arrived with a whopping 20,000 mercenaries from Syria and Greece, and Alexander even managed to attract some local allies. But it was at this point that another infamous episode in Alexander's life takes place, that being the Clitus the Black episode. And just as with the Persepolis Palace disaster, the story begins with a drunken party, this time in a big tent. And the bards or jesters or roast comics, whatever you want to call him, surrounding Alexander begin poking fun about the Macedonians' inability and impotence against Spitamenes, to which Alexander replies with good humor because he himself is not being singled out, but Clitus the Black takes very very poorly, and he begins ranting and raving about barbarians. And then Clitus challenges Alexander directly and tells him that he had turned his back on his father, on his fellow Macedonians, and he reminds him that he had saved his life at the Granicus. Alexander also loses his temper. He is held back by his men, and he tries apologizing to the Greeks and the other foreigners present. Clitus does not back down, however. And Alexander throws an apple at his head. Clitus is then dragged off, drunkenly quoting Euripides, saying, "Oh, how rotten things are in Greece." He eventually breaks free from those trying to drag him, and Alexander, having previously not been able to find a weapon because somebody had cleverly moved them out of the way, had now found a spear, and he plunges this spear into Clitus. Immediately, Alexander is racked with regret, just like at Persepolis, and then he positions the spear in front of him and tries to commit suicide, is stopped from doing so, and then spends the next 3 days and nights in his tent alone, not eating or drinking anything. But he also gets about 3 visitors. The first is Aristander, his therapist / soothsayer, who tells him that Clitus's death was ordained by the gods. Alexander was merely their instrument. His historian Callisthenes comes and tries to trivialize the whole thing, and then the philosopher Anaxarchus comes and tells Alexander to start behaving like a king, and that the death of one hardly meant anything for somebody who commanded so many other lives, and it seems that this latter advice is the one that resonated most with Alexander. Now, the good news for Alexander was that the walls were slowly closing in on Spitamenes, but the final nail in the coffin came from somewhere unlikely. So Spitamenes had one flaw, it was said by the sources, and that was an excessive fondness for his wife, one might say uxoriousness. And he took his wife on all his campaigns. Their sons fought on his behalf, and his wife was tired of it. She wanted to go home. She wanted their sons to be safe. And when she broaches this issue with Spitamenes, he loses his temper and threatens to kill her and sends her away. And while she is away, he is apparently unhappy with his concubines. He misses his wife, and he brings her back. And then, while they are sleeping together, she proceeds to kill him, chop off his head, and then ride to Alexander's camp and present the head to Alexander. Arrian's account, on the other hand, is a more sober one. He says that Spitamenes' officers did the job, which would make sense. The Sogdians and Scythians both seem to want to make peace at this point. With the Sogdian ulcer popped, Alexander proceeded to India, but because this was the winter of 328 BC, about 2,000 of his troops died of exposure crossing the eastern Sogdian mountains. This prompted one of those endearing camp anecdotes. Alexander welcomed a cold soldier into his tent, allowed him to sit on his throne, and warmed him by the fire. Because Alexander didn't like leaving enemies at his back, and this being quite logical because of his overstretched supply lines, he didn't want these enemies then compromising those supply lines. He besieged the Sogdian rock. The defenders laughed in his face and told him that his men would need wings in order to take it because this was a mountain fortress. And by this point, Alexander's men were pretty used to mountains. They had been already, being from Macedon, but they had scaled mountains and climbed mountains and accumulated gear because of all these expeditions into Bactria and Sogdiana. So Alexander sent 300 of his best climbers with linen rope and tent pegs to scale the mountain. 30 plunged to their death, but the next day, Alexander told the defenders of the Sogdian rock to look up, and they saw the 270 or so climbers and surrendered immediately. And then this started a chain reaction whereby all the mountain fortresses in eastern Sogdiana surrendered thereafter. After that, the 28-year-old Alexander finally decides to take a wife. It's kind of a curious choice. The daughter of a Bactrian noblewoman, the teenaged Roxana. She was supposed to have been very beautiful, so it may have been a marriage of passion just as much, if not more so, than politics. It was also time for Alexander to sire an heir, and his reasoning was that Roxana could probably be the first wife of many. As per Macedonian custom, Alexander strikes a loaf in half, just like he had struck the Gordian knot in half, I guess, and he gave one half of the loaf to his new bride. Now, in view of this marriage, the Macedonian Macedonians were just getting more and more uppity. They probably wanted Alexander to take a Macedonian wife and sire a full-blooded Macedonian heir. There had also been the Parmenian incident, the Philotas incident, the Clitus the Black incident. So Alexander was pretty mired in controversy at this point, not to mention the fact that he was training 30,000 Persians to fight like Macedonians, to speak Greek, and to be his new protectors. And the revolutionary aspect of this recruitment drive was that these Persians would not be auxiliaries. They would basically be fighting just like the Macedonians did with Sarisas and all the rest of it. Then, most famously, there was the proskynesis scandal. So the Persians have been cheek-kissing people from the beginning, but back then, they would only kiss their subordinates on the cheek, they would kiss their equals on the mouth, and then for the great king, they would get down on their knees and kiss his feet. And this was known as proskynesis. And in the past, in their interactions with the great king, when Greek emissaries were sent to him, they had already taken a stand against this and refused to kiss the great king's feet. And Alexander by no means forced any Macedonian or Greek to kiss his feet at this point. But this led to kind of an awkward situation at Alexander's court because it was a Macedonian and Persian hybrid court at this point. And so you had a situation whereby half of the court was not kissing Alexander's feet, the Persian half was kissing Alexander's feet, and so eventually Alexander came up with a solution. His solution was that he would place an idol of a god behind him so that the Greeks and the Macedonians could pretend in their mind like they are rendering homage to the god as opposed to Alexander. But Callisthenes, the historian of the expedition, the nephew of Aristotle, refused to do proskynesis, so Alexander basically decided to get rid of him. And he did this in a pretty clever way. He knew that Callisthenes had these sophist tendencies. Sophists like to argue just for the sake of arguing. Sophists are where we get the word sophisticated from. And Alexander challenged Callisthenes to give a speech in praise of the Macedonian army. And as soon as Callisthenes had finished doing that, Alexander challenged him to give a speech denouncing the Macedonian army. And Callisthenes, out of intellectual pride, decided to do this and got a bunch of the Macedonians riled up and angry at him. And this allowed Alexander to, shortly after, frame him in an altogether unrelated assassination attempt and then torture Callisthenes to death as punishment. As he neared India, Alexander decided to split his army in half. One half went with Hephaestion to the Indus River. This included the engineering corps, and they would make a bridge across the river. And Alexander, of course, took the mountainous path, the adventurous path, just as we might expect. And he proceeds to take town after town along this mountain range, and at one even receives an arrow to the shoulder, adding to his long collection of wounds. At some point, Alexander comes across the Aornus. This was another mountain fort that was supposedly impregnable. This already made Alexander want to take it because he liked doing the impossible. He didn't want to compromise those supply lines. But this time he had yet another reason. Supposedly, Hercules, his ancestor, had come to this very mountain fort and failed to take it, and so Alexander just had to try his hand. This was one of his last sieges, and perhaps the one he was proudest of, in light of Hercules' failure to take it and Alexander's eventual success. The way he manages to take it is he sends Ptolemy forward into the ravines around the city. There's a lot of skirmishing. Alexander eventually builds an earthwork mound to bridge the ravine. He gets to the hill opposite the ravine, makes a road, is repelled, and then eventually he and his men scale this hill with ropes and drive off the defenders. Alexander now arrives in India. He celebrates his arrival with an elephant hunt, and he meets a people named the Nicaeans. And the Nicaeans are an interesting group of people who make wine out of grapes, pretty uncommon for that region, and they also put their dead in coffins, which they don't bury, but put high up in the trees. And apparently Alexander and his men burned down a bunch of trees somehow and the coffins with them, but the Nicaeans don't seem too upset. They are Shiva worshippers, but they pose as Dionysians, or at least that association between Shiva and Dionysus is made, and this was just another example, but perhaps the most extreme example of religious syncretism between the Greeks and another people, in this case, those living in the Indus River Valley. Now, India was the 20th Persian satrapy, but by the time of Darius III, it was completely autonomous. Alexander, of course, took the mandate literally and wanted to properly add India to his empire. He immersed himself in the works of the Carian physician named Theseus, the explorer named Scylax, and of course, Herodotus, the father of history, who liked to visit the places that he wrote about, but in the case of India, never made it that far. As such, he had some pretty interesting things to say about India. He said that it was a land of gold, but that the gold was extracted from the earth by ants, presumably giant ants, but I'm not exactly sure. He also said the Indians only ate raw meat in some cases, and that they also ate corpses as a sign of respect, and especially the corpses of their fathers. All accounts agreed that India was the easternmost extremity of the world, that not far from the Indus River Valley, the great ocean that wrapped around the world would be found. But as Alexander went further and further east, he found that there was more and more east to explore. Eventually, Alexander makes it to Taxila, which is ruled by Omphis, the king of Gandhara, and he receives no such warm reception from the king of the Paurava, Porus. But however proud Porus was, he was also a capable leader, and he had 100 war elephants, and he was ready for a fight. In the spring of 326 BC, Alexander marches against Porus. This is monsoon season, so it is rainy and hot. All the waterways are overflowing, and Alexander proceeds to the biggest waterway in the region, the Hydaspes River, and on the other side, Porus is waiting for him. This time, Alexander opts for a little bit of caution. He doesn't cross right away. He gathers his men and the Indian spies among them, presumably, and tells them that they wouldn't cross the river for another 2 months. And he then orders grain shipments. He feigns some maneuvers along the river. He gives every impression of waiting until the end of the monsoon season to attack. But in the meantime, he's sending scouts to look for the perfect place to cross the river. During the secret crossing of the river, the monsoon whips up a storm, which Alexander thinks is going to be a good thing. Really doesn't end up so good. He thinks it's going to give him the element of surprise, but what really ends up happening is that his men get lost. They wind up on an island in the middle of the river instead of the other side of the river. And so because they don't have the time to make a bridge, they wade into the water and cross to the other side, and Porus's scouts spot them. But because Alexander and his men outnumber the Indians, even after he left a detachment at his camp to confuse Porus in case they are spotted, he decides to just proceed against him and go for the envelopment. Yes, the Indians have their war elephants, but Alexander had trained his men on how to deal with them. They would surround these elephants and skewer them with their sarisas while the archers tried to aim their arrows at the elephants' eyes, throw them into a rage, so that the elephants would then end up killing just as many of their allies as they would the enemy. Tragically, Bucephalus, Alexander's famous horse, would be pierced by a spear during this battle and would die, but Alexander had no time to mourn his loss, at least for the moment, and he grabbed another horse and continued fighting. Similarly, the enemy leader, Porus, would be the last man to continue fighting on his side. He was still on his massive war elephant. He refused to get down from it. Alexander sent a messenger to treat with him, but he chose Omphis, who Porus hated and apparently tried skewering with his spear. And so then Alexander sends a second messenger who is more successful. Omphis agrees to get down from his elephant, and the elephant, despite being wounded, is so well trained that it gets on its knees and allows Omphis to gracefully dismount. Alexander then beholds the 6-foot-tall Porus and asks him how he wished to be treated, and Porus replied, "Like a king." And much to Omphis's disappointment, Alexander allows Porus to continue ruling out of respect for him, but he is still heartbroken about Bucephalus, so he founds a city nearby and for once doesn't name it after himself, but after his fallen horse. Alexander then makes preparations to build a mighty fleet that would sail from the Hydaspes to the Indus and then into the sea. And because it would take time to build this fleet, he informed his men that they were going to invade eastern India in the meantime, and yes, during the monsoon season. So they were getting increasingly miserable. It was still monsoon season, plus they were reaching territory where the ground was so densely covered with snakes that they had to sleep in hammocks. Pretty soon they uncover a people known as the Cathayans, which are recorded as practicing sati or bride burning, apparently because one of their women had poisoned her husband, and these people occupied an entrenched position that Alexander was only able to take after receiving a little bit of help from his new buddy, Porus, and his war elephants. Alexander then reaches a land ruled by a guy called Soipietes, and he surrenders right away, which is a little bit surprising given that the reports of his people are a little bit Spartan. Like, they sound like Spartans in India. They divided their infants at birth into strong and weak and discarded the weak. And they also raised hounds that were so vicious they were said to have tiger's blood. And Alexander receives 100 of these hounds as a gift, and as a demonstration of their prowess, a group of them are made to fight a lion. And just as the hounds are getting the upper hand in the fighting, Soipietes, the king of this people, orders one of the hounds' legs cut off, and supposedly it has no reaction. It just continues fighting to the death because it bleeds to death eventually. Alexander then hears of people called the Gandharidae, who are ruled by a guy called Xandrimes. And Xandrimes is supposed to have had an army 224,000 strong. This is a report corroborated by Alexander's ally, Porus. And instead of being intimidated, you know Alexander by now, he was just excited about the prospect of beating this guy up and taking his lands. And so he gives his men a rousing speech, says that he was going to go alone if nobody followed him. But this time, there's no cheers, and his army is silent. And eventually, a dying veteran named Keenus, who had fought for both Philip and Alexander, rises to speak and says something to the effect of, "Alexander, we are tired. So many of us have died. Those who remain are barely recognizable. We barely remember our friends and families back home." And as he begins to speak more and more about his home, the men around Keenus begin getting excited about the prospect of returning to their homeland, and some even begin weeping openly. And Alexander, by this point, he is about 30, and he might be expected to be feeling his age, right? After all the campaigns, it was probably a harsh 30. But Alexander instead remains as single-minded as always, and he storms off to his tent and doesn't see anybody for 3 days, and all the while is expecting the soldiers to send someone along and beg his forgiveness and go along on another campaign even further east. But this time, the soldiers are unrepentant and they don't send anybody. And this time also, the soothsayers are on the soldier side. And so it was time for Alexander and his men to begin the long trek home. And before he left, Alexander ordered 12 great altars built, one for each of the Olympian gods. And he also, according to legend, left behind a fortress with oversized beds and horse troughs. That way, future generations would think that the Macedonians and their horses were giants, just as the Anglo-Saxons would later think of the Romans. The third and final part in the Alexander series will be coming out by the end of this month. In that part, we'll discuss Alexander's journey back to Babylon, where he dies. We'll be pausing to talk about an often neglected side of Alexander's legacy, the administrative legacy, and also talking about what life was like for the average person living in this colossal empire, however fleeting that moment was. We'll also talk about the aftermath, the Diadochi and their wars, as well as the afterlife of Alexander, some of the legacies and some of the ripple effects that his world conquest had, some of which I think you will find quite surprising, even if you know quite a bit about Alexander the Great. So with that said, thank you one more time for watching. A huge thanks to those supporting the channel as members and patrons, and I will see you all in the next video.